You know, I might get right into the questions, but I'll say you have a shared history as far as we talked about design and background, and I live the world of retail here at Gensler. So, I mean, from Gap, Banana Republic, Old Navy, L'Oreal, and Chanel, we're proud to say they're all our clients, and we work with them all, and we've still never crossed paths. So I love the book. I read it the last week or so, and I've got some questions. I usually go chronologically, which your book does, and what I really love was there were so many connections you draw to kind of your formative years growing up in St. Louis, being an exchange student in France, and then how all these things connect. So I think I'll try to connect the dots a little bit too. Cool. So early in your book, you talk about an experience in your later teen years. You're in a private school in St. Louis where you learn the lines of a character in a school play, and your teacher is Mr. Faust. Yeah. And you learned everything about the school play, and then he does this little trick. He has you take the other role. And what it does, it taught you to listen before speaking. Tell us about that first experience.
Yeah, so I was, when I was in high school, I really thought, this is one of those dreams, and it's funny being in LA, that perhaps I wanted to pursue a career in theater. And, you know, stars in my eyes. So I started taking these theater classes with a most amazing theater teacher. And what I realized that probably I would never be an actress. I wasn't that good. But what I did realize through working with him is the notion of early ideas, I should say, of empathy. Because the way that he taught us to act was that you'd get on stage and you would be with another actor rehearsing. And then suddenly he would come up and he was a big man, he would come up the stage sort of breathing heavy and grab your script from you and say, no, let me do it for you, and you stand in the other position. And all of a sudden, you had to listen to those lines said from a different perspective, and so that you actually understood how your message is being received, as opposed to not just how you were hoping to say it. So it was a very kind of early thought process around what it means to literally stand in someone else's shoes.
Well, it's also perception. You constantly talk about learning and unlearning, and there's a whole storyline through your book of drawing the connections of how you see things. So you leave St. Louis and you have this great opportunity to be an exchange student in France, and it's the dream come true. Your father had been there before and was a wine drinker and collector, and you had this love of France. I said I have the love of Italy, but I love your love of France. And so you go there, and you talk about, you start to forget the language and the rules of French because you learn how words are connected in a different way. Yeah. So it's that next connection.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Does everybody here speak a language or have tried at some point? So, you know, in school they teach you all of the vocabulary and you get the grammatical rules, and still when you're starting to speak, it's you know, I can't really get those words out the way that I wanted to. And what I learned about language, and I only speak French, so I don't speak multiple languages, but French taught me this, and I think any language, maybe Italian for you, is that I actually had to drop my own way of saying something. I had to get less attached to the grammar in English, to the vocabulary. So if I'm looking at this object, it's table. And there was a way that in order to really speak a language, it was an immersion into the context, the cultural context, the linguistic context, as opposed to, you know, memorizing every single vocabulary word and then grammar. And by the way, and be willing to make a ton of mistakes, because you will.
And you're learning life experiences in real time. I mean, when I studied Italian, I was so proud, and I went to a cafe and I said, "Bisogna una panini con prosciutto," and they were like, "Come on." And then the old man would walk in and say, and then you get it from because they knew how to say it.
So that.
It's being immersed in it. So mentors are something you talk about throughout the book. You had some incredible mentors, and you even had some that didn't work so well, but you talk about those stories. And you're very generous on the stories of what worked and what didn't, you know, fast failures and what worked really well. So I'd even say one of your early mentors was Fleur. Is that how you pronounce her name? Yeah. Fleur. I'm the worst French pronunciator, but we're going to all tolerate it.
Really
Fleur. And you talk about, you go to France and you meet Fleur, and she has this initiative to really immerse you in everything Paris, and you get the real version, and that's what living life is all about and being there. And you write, "The ability to see beyond constraints and to move through life in harmony with one's truest desires, matched with pragmatism, became a foundation for me, particularly in my orientation to business and my career. So tell us about you're in France, because it's going to lead up to L'Oreal, and what that was like and what you learned that was different than a U.S. St. Louis-based life.
Yeah. I should frame it a little bit by the story. My first trip was in France. I was 16 years old, and my father spoke fluent French because he actually learned without a textbook, which is an extraordinary way that they taught in his school. And then I just had a great French teacher. So I decided that I was going to go to France. 16, I went to on this program. And it was as if my senses had been just burst open by the beauty there. And I was lucky enough to be in the south of France where it was just, and I actually lived with a family. He was a garagiste, so he was a mechanic. And I even went back to pump gas one summer because I just loved being in that environment. And it was the light on the lime. So anyway, so long story short, I decided I must go back to France. And I don't know what I'm going to do. I need to get a job after college. My parents sort of said, college and that's it, and you're on
Up to you.
You're basically on your own. And so I would have absolutely swept floors. But as it turns out, when I was there on my semester abroad, I had met this woman who was, at the time you didn't have roommates there. Like, people didn't actually room together. And so I actually was going to, you remember the story, I was actually going to live in a convent which is weird because I'm Jewish. But that's how desperately I wanted to learn French. I was willing to do anything. And so I moved into this convent, and I had heard about one person at my college who had a roommate. And I tracked that person down, and I tracked the roommate down, and I finally was able to get together with her. And I actually went to visit her mother, who was a wonderful artist. She said, "I'm sorry, we've rented the place out." And so I moved into the convent. And 5 days later, out of some stroke of luck, she called me back and said, my daughter. And it was, I think we were almost polar opposites meant to be friends. I am and was exceedingly shy, really introverted, and very serious. I was a very, very serious student. She was wild and carefree, but her wildness was never sort of abandoned. It was always because she felt that she should be able to do what she wanted. And so I was watching her all the time, do crazy things, and I talk about it in the book, but we'd go out one night and she'd have to go to the bathroom, and she would pull her pants down and go in between two cars. I mean, it was sort of like life was there for her to be.
You were living a Godard film. You were
living
in
a
a
Godard
boot de
film.
souffle.
Yeah.
What was happening?
Yeah, absolutely. But it was for me, for somebody from the Midwest who had grown up in, yes, a liberal environment, but also the Midwest was conservative at that time. And all of a sudden to see a woman who was so comfortable with herself, who invited friends over and while she was in the bath, and men and women. And so there was something to me that really spoke to me about her embodiment of her comfort with who she was.
And some of that is such a French condition. I mean, later even in the book you talk about the meals. I was jealous of the meals you would have at L'Oreal and these great, eating real food at lunch and having a glass of wine. And I lived in Europe for a long time, and it was that situation. And it's very different when I first came back and you eat out of styrofoam at a desk. It's kind of the saddest existence you can, or if anyone brings me those sandwiches that are rolled up, that are really terrible. So let's get into some of your jobs.
Those are called wraps.
Yeah, I unwrap them because they're just so offensive, but that's a good name for them. So one of your first jobs out of college, you go back and you get, I think it's from Fleur, from her uncle or someone who worked for L'Oreal. Right. And you get this job, but it's not, it sounded glamorous when I first read L'Oreal, that's amazing. But you are you're selling shampoo to the, the hypermarkets out in the middle of nowhere. And it takes we were talking this morning, it's an immense amount of courage to just decide from your background, you're gonna get in a car and go stay in motels and go to these places. And I wanna pair this as you answer with, you have this design sensibility of kind of how things go. You had a seeing and a feeling, and you started to understand customers, and I think it becomes apparent to those you meet. So tell us about those years.
Yeah, so I guess the good news is through my relationship with Coulombe, that's her real name, I shouldn't have said that, it was in the book, Fleur.
Oh, so Damon's not a real person either? Oh.
No, her name's Coulombe.
Okay.
But through my relationship, I was able, I knew that after college I had to go back to France, and I would have moved there no matter what. And so I was lucky enough, her uncle said, listen, I can get you an internship. I can't promise anything. You know, you're on your own. Once you know, one of those things, and you may have had that happen, you get in the door, but once you're in the door, the rest is up to you. And their policies, they send you sur la route, which is on the road, for 6 months, sometimes a year. And in a way, I guess sort of the higher ranking you are once you come in, because they send all sorts of executives to do this, the longer they actually make you go on the road. And going on the road basically means you're living from motel to motel. And we had the right to go into a 2-star motel.
The Ibis, my
yeah,
favorite.
Ibis was our, everybody was staying in Ibis with the little suitcase, selling to hypermarkets, supermarkets. So my chain was in the north of France, which is a very industrial part of France, a coal mining region. And I would go from mammoth, really literally mammoth, and they were mammoth, hypermarkets, and sell hair gel and creams to the buyer. And the buyer was usually a guy who bought, in the case of the story I tell, sanitary concerns, peas, you know, all sorts of things, and you're trying to sell him studio line gel. I mean,
You're surrounded by meat hanging in the butcher shop,
yeah.
and you're talking about shampoos, yeah.
Yeah, I'm talking about shampoos, and so you can imagine that really he doesn't care so much about what I have to sell. And I, as a good doobie, I took out my marketing arguments and was looking at his hair, noticed that I was trying to sell mousse, and he had Brill cream in his hair. So I sort of switched that, but then that didn't really work either. It was really going to all be about, what will you give me for the end cap? And so we ended up negotiating in the way that he knew how, or the language that he spoke quite literally. But it was another early experience in kind of shedding your own belief system or your own preconceived ideas, because I had this idea that I was going to go in with my really pretty marketing speak.
You would say, I'll take it all, yeah.
Yeah, and it didn't quite work out that way.
But you get through it, so your first, some kind of negative experiences, you get through it, and you're at L'Oreal, and you get that next job. So you've gone through this, you've done your dues, and you have this meeting to present to the CEO and the regional directors. And it's one of the more uncomfortable first moments in the book where this presentation happens, a woman is presenting, and there's a whole kind of issue about sexuality there, about you walk in and you have a business suit and heels, and these are French men sitting there, all men, and they're looking at you as you walk in. And as you go through the interview and the meeting, you're there to listen. This person is kind of eviscerated for not knowing the information, and it's this wake-up call. It's one of your first that you share like that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I hadn't ever been in a boardroom before, and you're 22, 23 years old, and the product managers at L'Oreal, and perhaps they still do this, and it's become quite a actually generous company for women now, but back then it was just a different place and it was a different time. And so we would have to prepare endless amounts of those overhead many of you might remember overhead transparencies that you would get up, and you would have a stack of about 300. But what was, you had to know the answer to every question. And this woman got in and she was trying to sell something that clearly didn't have any interest to the powers that be at that time. And she basically, next day, her desk was empty. And it was for me, it was the first time that I realized what was at stake in the business world. And I had been a literature major. I mean, I was studying film as literary form. You mentioned Godard and Truffaut. And I cared so much about the packaging and the beautiful imagery that the advertising. And I didn't realize that actually this got fairly serious in this case, and that you actually had to really learn the ropes. And for me, learning the ropes, I had no education. I didn't go to business school. I had to start working right away. So I didn't have all the lingo that they had, all the marketing speak. So I realized that at this point, I actually would have to learn the ropes.
And it's not even being a woman, which was another issue, but it's just you're a Midwestern American who speaks French very well and has gone through this. Yeah. But these are all business people who've gone through a program, and they're curated up. There's no one who deviates. So you do meet a few who deviates. I think William is one of them.
Yes.
And you talk about this a term. We have Genserites. You had L'Orealiens.
L'Orealiens. Does anyone work at L'Oreal here? No.
Before we.
Okay. No, it's called.
Critique L'Oreal.
No, I wouldn't. I'm not critiquing them. It's L'Orealiens is what they. what they say.
So he's reviewing something with you, and he seems like the way I think many of us like to lead in this office. I certainly do, which he gets to the point where it was really about, he's talking about this presentation, and he said, we should look at that because you gave your opinion, and it's this moment, I have it in capital. You know, it's the we is, you felt a part of it, you were an equal, and you weren't the person in the business suit and the heels. You suddenly were, you had a person, and he didn't fit the mold too, right?
No, he was actually, in his spare time, which I thought was so cool, he was a referee for French basketball. And he had gone to all the right schools, but his demeanor and the way he behaved was quite different from everybody else who was pretty much cut from the same cloth at that time. There are three probably key business schools in France, and a lot of the executives there come from some of those business schools. So he was quite different in the way that the way he spent his time, and he also loved the aesthetic part of the business like me. And I had been working really hard while I was there because I soon realized that what I could do well wasn't going to be crunching the numbers. I mean, I could learn that. I needed to learn that. I needed to learn what market share meant. I needed to learn what market segmentation meant, and I needed to be able to use those terms. But what made me different was my ability to see and my ability to understand how image creates emotion for consumers. That was going to be my mark. And so very, very early in the time there, and there's a story in there about my time with William, because he cared about the same things. And so I was desperate just to work with the art direction. That was, I mean, I purposely put myself on the side of the table, literally, with the art director. We had an ad agency, McCann Erickson at the time, and I just wanted to be a part of what they were doing and see through their eyes.
Well, you say, I started to discover how to subvert the rules and create a context in which the design team could invent something inspirational. And that ability, I mean, we appreciate that in any client too, because you want to have someone with a design eye. The business eye is good. We're partial to the design eye here. So the next person up is James, is an art director. So finally you have this ability to, by having those meetings and keeping your eye open and setting a course for yourself, James is a mentor and a collaborator, and your appreciation is kind of like Godard. You see this image that he creates and what he puts together, and there's a kind of ease about it. And you start to get involved with this. You're finding a model for a campaign. And I think I have it here. This is great. So James is speaking about selecting models for the campaign, because I had a different view of how it works in the modeling industry, and it's quite a different time now, of course. He says to you, this is their job. They are paid well. You have to think about their faces and bodies as the tools to create an aspiration. You think about it, and this light bulb goes off. Tools to create an aspiration. But you realize, you elevate it, they use their beauty to create something for others, a stronger, more empowering view of women. Tell us more about that, because that really, you owned what that was all about.
Yeah, I think I had been in situations where we would go through books of models, and I would listen to this art director, James, discuss the features that he thought would make them. I was in hair colorants, so hair was very important. So we talk about thickness of hair, other attributes that he knew the higher ups at the company at L'Oreal would be most sensitive to. But what really I noticed is what he was looking for wasn't just those plastic outside attributes. He was looking for what was coming out from within the model, and he would say what she could give the camera. And I always thought that was so interesting that, in fact, the view of the artist or his art director wasn't so much, she has the right hair, the right nose, but it was the connection that she can make, the emotional connection she makes. And it got me thinking that, and being in France in general, about how we think about beauty and how we look at beauty, and whether, I feel like often we confine it to plastic beauty, but in fact, and we all know this, but it's sort of, we don't talk about it that much, that beauty is sort of the connection that you make to the object itself. It is created in the moment, and it's not just some kind of perfection, or at least I personally think imperfection is way more beautiful.
Well, you start a dialogue, because you talk about Roland Barthes, this essay of like when you read into the idea of when the author reads into the story, when the reader reads into the author's story, they kind of deconstruct it. And I was in school at the time of deconstructivism and phenomenology, and there's a lot of Heidegger in there in this discussion. So, so you go through this period, and then you meet Antoine, who becomes the love of your life, and you have children with him. And he's also, I mean, you're actually on a really good trajectory of positive. I didn't get to gap yet of what happened with Damon, but he's the one who sees you for who you are, and you have this real connection with him. And then you decide, you finish your time at L'Oreal, and you make this big leap to go, of all places, to California and move to San Francisco. And I should say right now, Gap is the story Art Genzer always tells us. Gap is our first client. So Don Fisher, it's really, we did the first Gap store, and I think we've built them every day for 50 years now. So you go there, and what draws you to it, tell us a little bit about this and your relationship with Mickey, but you're walking down the street and you see one of those great Miles Davis posters, this super black and white poster, super dark, and you just see Gap on it, and you're like, what is this even an ad for? And it's so different from the world you just left.
Yeah, when I was living in France, the French have a really keen appreciation for jazz. And James, the art director with whom I became friends in the end, we went to a photo shoot in New York, and while we were living in Paris, and he took me to the Blue Note, and I got to see Dizzy Gillespie. And we sat really close, and I got to watch those cheeks and listen to the riff, listen to a musician as he plays this incredibly complex jazz tune, and then go off and improvise. And it was one of those moments of just pure appreciation for that art. So when we ended up moving to San Francisco pretty much on a whim, without jobs, which was retrospectively maybe not that smart.
You were 25.
But I was, and we didn't have kids yet, but we only had a very short supply of money, so I was interviewing with all these companies, and I thought, I'm a marketer. I have this label now. I've worked for 3 years at L'Oreal. I'm a marketer, so I go to interview at different companies. I got one interview at Clorox, because the two big packaged goods company were Clorox and Del Monte. Mm-hmm. And they didn't hire me anyway because I had according to them, I had no credentials. But
you weren't a bleach person. You weren't a bleach person.
I couldn't imagine going to a photo shoot of toilet bowls. I just, it just didn't seem plausible. But I'm now, at N minus about 5 days of money supply, and I'm walking down the street. And Antoine is French, so he's got a hard challenge to find a job immediately. I'm walking down the street, and I see these posters, but one of them just stopped me in my foot tracks, and that was the late and great Miles Davis. And he's got his head in his hands. I don't know, for those of you who remember this ad campaign, you probably do. Soulful look in his eyes. And he's wearing a black t-shirt, and it says Gap. What? Wow, I want to go market that company.
And you get this opportunity, so you call and you get this meeting. So Mickey Drexler is kind of the...
I just sent my resume. I didn't have any connections. I just sent my resume. At the time, we had snail mail.
Yeah, exactly. You did not send a fax or an electronic message. So you get there, and you walk in, and he's on the phone. And tell us about that character, because he is just, you describe him so much of who he is. He just gets stuff done, and he's this amazing person.
Mickey, who has been my mentor for years and friend, is an incredibly excited, and I walked into his office. He has his feet up on his desk. Now, I've come from L'Oreal. Everybody's in suits and ties. I'm now in California. He's got his feet up on his desk. He's talking about, yeah, great. Oh my God, amazing. And he is just going off a million miles a minute. He takes me through the offices to go to a Banana Republic meeting. He goes, come, follow me. These are supposed to be an interview. I'm like, don't you sit face to face? And he's like, no, come, you're going to follow me. And every single cubicle, people sit out in the halls in cubicles those days, and he stopped to every single person and said, hey man, what's going on? Hey, how you doing? And so people, when Mickey would say, how you doing, you couldn't just say, I'm fine, or you couldn't just say, I'm doing all right. You had to answer.
There's got to be something going on.
Yeah, exactly, come on, you got it nailed. Yeah. And so you would have to say, as a merchant, and usually we were a merchant-driven company, you would have to say, well, we're selling 45,000 units of it, and you'd have to have something at the ready when Mickey would come down the hall. But he ended up taking me into a Banana Republic conference room and asking me what bags I liked. And it was one of those crazy moments where
how incredibly empowering. You just came here, you're 25, you walk in, and you're being asked your opinion by the leading retailer in America.
Although it was smaller then, but yeah.
Well, they're pretty big, and Banana Republic was still doing all the funky safari stuff at the time. So you go through, but the answer is you get your first position, which is, I have it here, socks and belts.
Merchandising trainee of socks and belts.
Which is there to Chanel. We're going to get there in the last 10 minutes of this talk. So you get to socks and belts, but you go through and you work through fixing up the storerooms, and you develop ideas on the belts, and there's a lot of dialogue along the way and things you learn. But you have a rough situation I found it rough in Hong Kong. You finally get this opportunity to get to Hong Kong. And as many of you know, for retail, for furniture, for apparel, I mean, Hong Kong is the place you typically go a lot, or to Kowloon. So you're there, and you're with Damon, who I imagine is not his name, but this individual who's not always the fairest about making decisions, is not Mickey exactly, is a manager who wants quick answers, and you've had some run-ins with him. And tell us about the situation that happens and how you deal with it, with this package.
Yeah, so, you know, as a merchant, one of the things that in the beginning seems like the most romanticized thing that you could do is go to Hong Kong. I had never traveled to Asia. And so for me, this is a big trip, and these trips are really exciting, and you meet with we call them vendors, but they're, you know, it's the suppliers, and you negotiate prices, you visit the factories. But I had Damon, a boss who worked very late at night, and we worked all weekend. So there wasn't, this is back in those days. I see you there, she knows. She used to work at the Gap. You know, but don't
Don't say his name.
I don't know if you were there then, but anyway, we were in about 8 p.m. on a Sunday night, and we were doing color breakdowns, which is basically figuring out how much per color of, I don't know, a T-shirt or something. And this person used to argue over, I don't know, 500 units, which even in those days was not a lot, and the cost of those units is nothing. It's 8 o'clock at night. During that time, the head office head bursts into the office and says, there is a package in the elevator. Everybody needs to vacate. We're in the 20-something floor, I don't remember. And so everybody just sits there, and Damon puts his head back down and starts working. And there's this sort of lull.
You're watching the faces, I can imagine.
Yeah, and I was terrified. So he said, there's nothing, let's just keep going on. He sends the guy back, says, it's nothing, go ahead. And so something happened. I don't know if I started picturing my husband back at home, our desire to have a family. I think it was even before I had kids, but something happened, and I just said, you know what, I can't stay. I said, if you want to keep working, that's okay, but I think we should leave. I mean, even if there's nothing in the package, why would you take the risk? We all have families. And eventually, he got very, very angry at me. My team, I was, by the way, the lowest person on the totem pole at that point. The team, everybody looked up at me with these, they didn't want to say anything because they were afraid to get for the repercussions. With grateful faces, they just were like, oh. So I started to walk out, and then the strangest thing was, he held open the elevator to make sure that everybody got out of the office, which was weird. And he didn't talk to me for probably a few months after that.
Well, but it changes the whole perspective. You decided to speak up and own your voice there, and it changed the perception of other people. They started to see you as this leader who had that voice and said something. One more story about Gap that is really key for, I think, a lot of people here is you're in the women's position, you're in charge of denim. Wasn't it women's bottoms, too? That's what they called pants back then, women's bottoms.
Which is hard to imagine that it didn't dawn on us at that time that was a strange sounding part.
Strangely odd, because they weren't men's bottoms. So you're 7 months pregnant, you're presenting to Mickey, and you paint this picture of all the positives and his energy level, and you've got a rack of clothes, and you're going through things. And he wants you to get this denim that you loved, and not in the one model, but in their best-selling model. And it's a dialogue back and forth. But you're realizing you're not totally listening to him at the time. And he wants to teach you a very valuable lesson, and it's probably one of the most generous passages of how he deals with this. But tell us the story and kind of how he called you after.
So I was new to the denim department, and I had found what I thought was the greatest finish, the newest, hottest finish. I'd also been noticing, and this is in the 90s, that the classic fit jean that the Gap had wasn't performing as well. People weren't wearing it as often. It just didn't seem to be as prevalent as it had been before. So I decided this brand new finish, I'm going to put it in this new fit called the stovepipe or the wide leg. And so I get to this meeting. I actually got called into the meeting quite suddenly, so I wasn't expecting it. My boss was on maternity leave, So I sat down and I started to explain this amazing new finish. I'm putting this amazing new jean and I'm selling the thing. And Mickey's like, wait. Well, what about what's your best selling jean? And Classic Fit still was the highest unit selling. He's like, why aren't you putting the new finish in your
Love
classic?
the fabric, put it in the, yeah.
Yeah, new fabric,
yeah.
rejuvenate your Classic Fit jean. And I was convinced that that wasn't the right thing to do, so I kept at him. I said, no, this is a new finish. We got to put it in the new hot jean. And I did it probably 3 times. I went back and tried to convince him. And finally, he just blew up. He said, enough. You're not hearing a word I'm saying. You're not listening. And of course, at the time, I was 7 months pregnant. So I am sobbing, thinking I've lost my job. I have no way to support my family. My husband was pretty much a stay-at-home dad by that point. I don't know what to do. And I got back to my desk, and the phone rings and says, "Hi, Maureen Miquet." He said, "Listen, you have to learn to listen. And it's not just because I'm the boss, but you're a good merchant. But if you want to be a really good merchant, you're going to have to open your ears. Listen to everybody, really take stuff in." I was like, oh, thank you.
And what an incredible lesson to offer that. And you said, he didn't have to do that, but he decided to make sure, it mattered to you.
Yeah, I think he's a very generous leader that way, because I think he's very willing to give straight up feedback. And he has a desire to see people win and see people do well,
So we have about 5 more minutes. I'm going to get to Chanel now, but it's been an incredible journey to get there. So you go through Old Navy, Banana Republic, president of Banana Republic. You have this great background, and you get this call from a headhunter that you decide to return the call about this opportunity with a privately held company in France, and you figure out it's Chanel. You go through this incredible kind of 1.5-year interview process that I'll say culminates with a meeting in New York with a psychologist for a 5-hour interview in a room full of pink teddy bears. This is going to get you to buy the book. And it's sort of like all comes together. So just tell us about the journey to get to Chanel.
So I was at Old Navy when I got this strange call from a headhunter who had actually used to work at the Gap. The first call was about going to American Eagle. And I thought, well, I don't really want to move to Pittsburgh, and they're sort of similar jobs. I said, don't call me again unless you have something I can't refuse. And about a couple months later, he called me again and said, I have something you can't refuse. So he described a privately held French luxury brand. Now, I had always aspired to be at Banana Republic, which for me at the time was luxury, and is for many of us.
When it switched to the luxury.
Yeah, I mean, it was considered our luxury. Yeah. And so I was thrilled to hear that a French, I mean, I love France. French luxury brand was interested. I've deduced that it was Chanel because there were only 2 luxury brands at the time that were privately held. So anyway, the courting process took about a year. And I just kept going back and having an interview and then another interview. And it was just Chanel time. They wanted to make sure, and I think they were taking their time to really consider what this might mean for them. Finally, we have a handshake, and we're agreeing that I'm going to move. And they said, one last thing, if you could go to New York, we like to do psychological testing. Corporate psychologists, which by the way, lots of companies do. It's not uncommon. But the crazy part of it was, I got to the address, and it was on the Upper East Side, and the building was a bit dilapidated, and the steps were cracked, and I thought, oh, is this a setup? What's happening here?
Let's see how you deal with this. Yeah.
I got a little nervous. I got in, and the gentleman got me to the 2nd floor, the psychologist. But when I opened the door it was an apartment, number 1, which was really strange. And I thought, is this part of the test? And I'm having this whole internal dialogue, like, what's going to happen to me? Is this part of the test? Are they watching to see how I'm reacting? They're teddy bears. And I kid you not, pink, purple, I mean, mostly pink, but teddy bears everywhere. Everywhere I looked, there were teddy bears. And I thought, this has got to be like, they're going to see what happened.
There's a camera on you, right?
Yeah, what, are they throwing me off? And it turns out he asked me 5 hours of questions, a battery of questions of things like, you're sitting in a library and somebody comes next to you and they're making a lot of noise. What do you do? I'm like, oh, I would get up and move. Well, let's assume there are no other seats. What would you do? I'm like, okay, are they testing my conflict management skills? I mean, these incredible sort of inner dialogues we have during this thing. But I guess I passed. I think the funniest thing was afterwards he asked me to do a handwriting sample. And this is after the strangest questions you've ever heard. And he said, could you please do a handwriting sample? I said, oh, okay. And he said, oh, the French.
So it's the ultimate. So for the last part, Ted, are we okay in time for my last question? So you get to Chanel, you get this incredible job as global CEO. You described Coco Chanel, I mean, there's such an allure, I'm sure, in this room, and myself included. You write about how she was more than a designer. Her life was a meta-story of femininity, embodying all of the complexities of today's woman. Masculine and feminine, driven and sensitive, determined and alluring. And you get this position in your first year or more is kind of an auditing year of just seeing how they do things, watching the bottles come together, watching the packaging, seeing what's made. Tell us about the experience and what it meant to you.
Yeah, which is the most amazing thing, and I think partially because being a privately held company and partially just really good business sense, but the owner said, look, you're gonna have to go through training. And this training was actually a 3-year period. So, you know, it seems like each time in my career, whether it was going to the Gap from L'Oreal, I was agreeing to start over in some respect. So in a way it was starting over because I was a trainee and I had a full year of traveling around the country, going into all the offices from creative to the factories to regional offices in every part of the world. And what they told me is, you have only one job, and that's to listen, ironically, but you can ask questions, but otherwise put a piece of tape on your mouth. Like, we don't want your opinion. You know, it is not going to be about your opinion, and we don't want you to make one business decision until you've actually really integrated and understood. And it was an amazing moment. But the funniest story was my parking space right near Rue Cambon. I had a parking space. This is to tell you that I was really a trainee. It was 7 levels down into the dungeon. I was at the very bottom level.
Yeah.
It was almost
You're back to socks and belts.
It was symbolic,
Yeah.
and I had to squeeze my little mini into this spot. But it was actually the best thing that happened to me. I spent a year doing this, and then 2 years as an operational president for the U.S. business, which also was really great because I needed to learn how all that beautiful creativity gets articulated and exposed into the boutiques and counters.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. So
it's that time of the morning for questions. Just a quick reminder, around here, questions start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are questions. There's no such thing as a 2-part question, and only Erwin gets to ask the follow-up questions. So who gets to go first?
Wow.
It does work, this system.
Hi. In the beginning, you had mentioned empathy as an important quality. I'm just wondering, in terms of women in leadership, how do you turn empathy into an asset versus a weakness?
It's such a great question, and it's something I've grappled with myself. And I've grappled with a lot of women executives who've worked with me, men also, because I think we ignore that we all have the capacity for empathy, and it's not, while it might be somewhat intrinsic, it's also a shared quality. First, I just want to say that I think it's a 21st century quality. So I think that if we're in a world that's divided right now, and I feel like empathy is more and more needed, but I also think it's a skill that you need in almost any job, like marketing. If you're going to actually try to sell something to somebody, especially if you're in any kind of fashion, any not need business, you're not selling soap, but even soap has, you have to understand where somebody else is in that, and what their concerns are, what their needs are, what their desires are. So and for me, as a woman leader, when I first got to Chanel as the CEO, I was actually at a table of all men, and I was trying to figure out how on earth am I going to lead this iconic French brand. I had no luxury experience. They all had 2 decades of luxury experience. I was young. I was just over 43. I was American. I had almost everything stacked against me. And what I realized pretty early on was if I just tried to sort of put up my dukes or insist that I knew where we were going, which, by the way, I had no idea, that I actually was going to fail. And they would probably throw me out. So that sitting on their side of the table, asking them questions and listening actually became sort of a hallmark, and it's what created a relationship with the team, but it also ended up helping, that sort of methodology ended up helping us reshape our culture. And so while not, I know that when you're not an executive and maybe you're working in not the higher echelons, it's hard to be empathetic. Like that is hard because you worry that where's the line between that and being really overly vulnerable. But I also think that you can still stand your ground and be empathetic. Doesn't mean you give up who you are. It means that you truly take someone else's opinion in and you listen And that opens debate for us.
Well, you made a conscious decision of this it was the active and conscious leadership journey. You introduced things at Chanel that changed things. You brought women onto the board or into the leadership positions. And then one other one I do have to mention is you got to meet several times the horse whisperer, the woman who wrote the book on this. And that was, so where someone's talking about human empathy, you learned it through so many other methods, and you're here walking a mare around and learning how the relationship between you and a horse was this. You couldn't cause it to do things you didn't want. You were in charge. So
Horses are not political. They don't have an agenda other than they look to the matriarch mare. So I had this interesting experience meeting a horse whisperer, and it was because I wanted to bring some unusual type of leadership work to the team at Chanel. And so I went to do this work myself to see if it was, legit.
Yeah.
And basically they put you in a ring with a horse and say, do whatever you want. And you have a lead line, but the lead line is actually not attached to the horse. So my first instinct was, I want that horse to love me. And indeed the horse nuzzled up to me and I'm like, oh, aren't I so good? And I started to walk. And the horse started to follow me. I'm like, I'm a good leader. I was all proud of myself until the horse started to bonk me with his nose, literally. And
too much love.
Yeah, it's a little too much love. And Martha, who was one of the coaches there, said, stop, Maureen, is this what you want to happen? I'm like, well, I'm glad the horse is following me, but I'm getting a little uncomfortable. And she said, does that remind you of anything? So to your point, it's, sometimes I think you can let in somebody too much, and it creates a situation where you don't have boundaries. So I think the establishment of boundaries is also important.
While I walk my way over to this question here, would you comment about involving the Chanel brand in causes and the role of brands in activism of any kind?
Mm-hmm. I think, it's so interesting. I feel like appropriating a cause for a brand, so if you just want to adopt a cause, is a marketing, I don't want to say marketing ploy, but it tends to be a marketing tool, let's call it. Whereas what I think, what makes me interested, or what gets my attention in the world today, are companies that are purpose-oriented, whose causes and the company itself are completely in alignment. So I look at companies like REI, where they close for Black Friday,
Black Friday, yeah.
Opt-outs, and that's in line with who they are as a brand. Or I look at, I love Equality Has No Boundaries by Nike right now. We are in a world where everybody's an athlete to them, and they're showing us truly everybody's an athlete. And so I feel like, and I don't know how to say it in another way, when you're just appropriating a cause because you want to look like you're doing good, then I as a customer, get a little bit more suspicious. But when that cause is so deeply connected to who you are, or, I think about, in many ways, Tesla, on the high end of the scale, they make beautiful cars. They have all the competitive advantages of beauty, of technology, but they're trying to change the way we think about our environment and the way we use gas. So anyway, that's what interests me about these kinds of companies.
When assessing so when launching a new product or a business and trying to figure out what's the best way to bring the message to consumers, how do you assess whether or not that message is best brought by a celebrity, such as like the Miles Davis Gap ad, or just your average everyday consumer? How do you determine what would resonate?
For most of my career, I worked with great creative people. And often it started as a dialogue of creativity, of what would they think best embodied that point of view, whatever it might be, whether it was clothing or makeup or fragrance. And a lot of the conversation would be around, how do you get that message across? And so I think sometimes it's appropriate that might be a celebrity or another spokesperson. We did, towards the end of my time at Chanel, we did we definitely used Kira quite a bit, but we did something online called Outside Chanel, which we actually took lesser known, really accomplished women in all sorts of fields who spoke to what they had done in their lives, and they embodied Chanel's spirit. So to me, it's really about how you embody the message as opposed to whether or not it's a celebrity or not a celebrity. Sometimes celebrities do that, sometimes it could be somebody else, or not a person, you know, depending on what you want to say. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Just wanted to get to your experience as a mother and as a leader, and how for you that balance worked and or continues to work, and what perhaps you think women leaders who want to encourage other women to go down both paths at the same time, what you can offer us in business who are trying to support other women in doing that.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's probably the hardest chapter for me to write in my book was a chapter when my kids are already grown. So my kids are now 21 and 24. But I had taken my oldest daughter college visiting, and it was a rough day. We were arguing about little stuff. But that night at dinner, she just blew up, and just everything that I didn't really realize was happening came out in that one moment about how I was never there. I was always on a plane to Hong Kong. How could I tell her what to do? You know, Daddy was always the one at her soccer games. And it hit me so hard. I mean, I literally, my tongue was swelling in my mouth, and I ran to the bathroom, and I broke down and cried. I could barely breathe. And it was interesting because I came out of that, and we never actually resolved that moment. In a way, I regret that. I mean, I'll say that really honestly, regret not resolving. Although the strangest thing happened later on. She was getting she was writing her college essays, and she, you know, beautiful green eyes and staring at the computer, and I walked by her, and she says, "Mom, can you help me on my college essays?" And I helped her, and she thanked me. And then every time I go to her school to speak, she'd bring all these friends. And she finally said to me, right after she graduated from college, she said, and I helped her find her first passion for her first job. She said, "Mom, I know that you didn't cook or clean or iron, but at least you could help me figure out what I want to do in my life and help me with my career." And so what I realized is nothing is perfect. And we hold, all of us, this ideal of perfect work-life balance. And it's like just by holding that idea, we're already setting ourselves up for sadness and disappointment. There will be sadness. I mean, I cried on planes to Hong Kong. I mean, I sat in hotel rooms in very lonely ways. But I think if I had to go back, somebody asked me this the other day, and it was such a good question, if you could do it over again, would I choose to work? Would I choose to work with that intensity? And the answers to that question are yes. What I would have done differently, though, is I would have actually had those conversations that I didn't have. That I was so, you know, happy that Antoine could stay home. I mean, in the beginning, we couldn't really afford full-time nanny. So he chose to, we both chose for him to stay home. And that part worked out okay, but it was really the not having that conversation or telling her kind of what it was like for me and listening to what it was like for her or for my other daughter, Mimi.
And you had two other components that come up since you mentioned. I mean, there's a real love story with Antoine and raising your family, and there's a symbiotic relationship of how you worked. I mean, he was the Mr. Mom, and he was cool with it. He was like, you know what, for the money we're going to pay a nanny, I could be home with the kids, and he was happy to do this. So you had this dialogue, and I think you had great leaders in your life, too, who helped enable you, too. I mean,
That's
Mickey
exactly
and others.
Right. I mean, the gap was actually, I couldn't have landed in a better place, but I do have to say, and it's so hard, you know, we don't always have a choice where we work, but in as much as we can and have a choice, I think one of the things you said, what's the advice? It's also looking at the company, the boss, the place you're going to work, and really making those decisions. In many ways, one of the reasons I left L'Oreal, and again back in the 80s, was because I didn't see any women role models. So I made a choice. It was a risky one. I'm not sure I would recommend that to everybody. Just stop and use every bit of savings.
Luckily, there are more women role models, more and more.
But I needed to have that. I needed to be able to see that women could actually do something back then. So.
You've described several times in your career kind of stepping into roles where you felt that everyone around you had more experience than you and more knowledge of the industries that you were stepping into. How have you, as an introverted person, grappled with the fear of failure and shored yourself up to just go out there and do it?
Wow, that's such a great question. I think I'm very curious, and I have kind of an explorer's mind. And so for me, what that means is I'm willing to take the risk because I'm so curious about what it is that I am into. And then I also feel like I wouldn't take a risk if I really didn't think it was something that I believed in or cared about. So when I got to Gap, when I saw that Miles Davis poster, and when I saw what it meant to make these beautiful clothing, you know, the beautiful clothing Gap, even at Old Navy, we didn't talk a whole lot about Old Navy, but one of my best,
Which was
one of the,
surpassed Gap.
yeah, we
I
did,
mean,
but with the job that I was able to do there was one of the most fun jobs. It was almost as if like that kept me going. Like the notion that I was getting to do something that I so loved to do, and that it sort of made me a little less, it's like France, it's like going and speaking French. It made me a little less fearful, a little more fearless when I knew that I was kind of getting into something that I cared so much about. I think if you know, tomorrow if you said, would you go into the banking industry or something that I would never be good at, my fear would be so high and I, you know, couldn't do it. But somehow that's what keeps me going. Yeah.
A couple more questions. If anyone has one, please raise your hand.
There's one in the front, Ted.
One in the front.
Hi. So I actually used to work at Chanel in Neuilly, and I was curious because coming from Old Navy, that very different background, what sort of pushback you might have seen and how you overcame it at Chanel?
Well, I mean, you didn't imagine that I was selling T-shirts off of a pickup truck at Old Navy. I mean, we were excited when we had 1 million. I'll never forget. We sold this thing. I'm looking at Teresa because someone is from the Gap. We sold a T-shirt with a flag on it, and you know, the flag tee, famous flag tee. And there was a day that we sold 1 million units, and that the trend that was our report that showed us sales didn't even hold that many. So now you go to Chanel, and so you know, in Gap, my whole headset was more is better. You know, sell more things to more people all the time. And now you get to this place where it's all about preciousness and rarity. And so one of the hardest adjustments for me was to figure out how to change my mindset from the sort of more to less is more, to every customer is a precious customer. And I think that was from a transition standpoint, business-wise, really, really tough for me. It was really tough to get my head around, wait a minute, why wouldn't you sell more of that classic handbag? I don't get that. And you know, once I understood, it became very much a part of, you know, the way I could lead the business, but it took me a little while to get that.
But you did change. I mean, you built retail stores. Asia started to take off. So there were other markets that grew, and it wasn't the Chanel you knew when you came. I mean, you vastly changed it.
Yeah, Chanel grew about 3 times while I was there. It became a very, you know, huge company. And I think the luxury industry in general grew. So as part of I almost think it might be a bubble of more consumer demand for luxury products. Certainly the opening of China and the influx of tourism around the world from all different Asian countries has influenced that. And even the internet to a certain degree, although the internet is probably one of the more dangerous things or scary things for really refined luxury companies, yeah.
And our final question for the morning.
It's a lot of pressure. Thank you very much. I liked when you mentioned that as a female leader, you can do it your way. You don't have to play the guy's game, if you would.
Right.
In our society, I believe traditional role models are completely in transition. And the flip side is there's no real point of orientation in like, how do we behave with each other and who is playing which part, right? And that impacts on private life, personal life as well. I know a lot of great women with great careers going on, and then they have a hard time finding a life partner because men don't know how to deal with that type of woman, even though these are perfectly female, vulnerable women. It's not, you know what I mean, the kind of male dominant type of woman. So what's your piece of advice or perspective on this?
I think that's really, you've spoken to some of the most important things. I think, you know, first of all, the skill sets that we need in this, I think in this era, are both feminine and masculine, or what sociologists label as feminine and masculine skill sets. But I also have a lot of empathy for men right now, because as we talk about, more women's empowerment, and finding a place that a man also feels comfortable, I think is part of all of our jobs, men and women alike, so that it's not because women grow that men don't. And I think this is not an either or, it's an and. And my perspective is that these so-called, I guess what many call feminine leadership qualities, are actually qualities we need to adopt to be in this crazy, fast-changing, uncertain world. So I don't pretend to know this all, but what I've seen in my own experience introducing feminine leadership qualities in a company that was actually run by and large by men was it does tend to open up more creative thinking, more innovation. And so if we can, and I don't have advice about how to find a soulmate, so I'm off topic for you. Maybe I could write another book, but no, your point's a valid one. I don't have the answer. I really don't. I don't know the answer.
But I think throughout the book, I mean, to wrap up, there's a lot of the talk about the duality, about being a woman, feminine qualities, masculine qualities, and the benefits of both. So I mean, you're always wrestling with that, and it's a very empathetic story to men and women. I mean, throughout. So I want to thank you very much, Ted.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you.
Thank you all for